Every co-op and condo board depends on its bylaws to function. But what happens when those rules are decades out of date? Outmoded quorum requirements, obsolete sponsor provisions, and antiquated language can tie a board's hands and open the door to disputes.
At the Folsom Group, our mission is to help boards make smart decisions every day. From end-to-end property management searches and construction project management to cost optimization, we help boards achieve sustainable savings, on-time projects, and long-term performance that speaks for itself.
I'm Emily Myers with Habitat Magazine, and my guest today is Dean Roberts, Senior Partner at Norris McLaughlin. Dean, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Emily. Pleasure to be here.
So you've seen firsthand how outdated bylaws can create real problems for boards. Can we start with an example of a building where perhaps quorum issues or stale bylaw language put the board in a difficult spot?
Yes, there are plenty of examples, but two leap to mind is we were retained by a very prestigious high-end co-op, and I asked to review their corporate documents. They come over. The bylaws are a Xerox of the offering plan from like 1969. The pages aren't straight. They, are just out of whack, and they're numbered like page 102 to 118, which makes no sense. But what that tells you is nobody's touched these documents since the sponsor created them.
Well, so can outdated bylaws sort of actually open a board up to legal challenges then from shareholders?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, this is the classic example of an ounce of prevention, pound of cure kind of problem here is most boards don't think about their bylaws much, even though they're the core of the corporate, operating procedures. They're the owner's manual for the co-op for a lot of purposes. But it's one of those things that you don't really deal with them until you usually have a crisis or an issue, oftentimes involving elections or how to deal with a renegade board member, or you go to the document and language you need just simply isn't there.
You were going to talk about a second example.
I have, we represent a number of Mitchell llamas, which most of them were created 1950, late 50s to mid 1970s. Oftentimes their bylaws are untouched. But the one I loved was for 20 plus years, the co-op was operating with board of director terms for 3 years as a sort of standard. It's either 1 year or 3. Because of a typo, when they created this co-op in 1963, it said 2 years. They had never operated with anything but 3 years. So the bylaws were completely out of sync. And as part of a complete upgrade of their bylaws, because the term limits came into play during COVID when they missed a couple annual meetings in the board terms, and they suddenly realized they had an entire board up for election as opposed to the 2 or 3 they thought they had.
Okay, so could that have perhaps invalidated the previous board?
Not so much in theory, it would create a legal challenge that you had directors operating beyond their legally mandated terms. There's a counter argument that says since they weren't replaced, there was no harm. But it's one of those things where theoretically there are a lot of bad things that could happen, especially if you get into a situation where you're having a battle with a problematic shareholder. This is where bylaw issues often come into play, is the board is wanting to do something and the issue with the bylaw creates a roadblock to that happening. It becomes a weapon to be used against them.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned a Mitchell llama. Is this something that is prevalent in Mitchell llama and limited equity co-ops for any reason?
No, it's not unique to them. I've found bizarre things and missing things from Park Avenue to the Bronx to Queens. It's endemic with all co-ops because it's changing, but for the longest time, nobody ever bothered to look or review bylaws.
there are obviously a raft of issues that can come up. Is quorum, is a building able to get a quorum? Is that a particular issue?
That is one of the biggest issues right now, especially in the Mitchell Llamas, because there have been changes to the law that make you can't use electronic voting, and there's a lot of difficulty. You have to do a lot of procedural stuff to get the votes in. So as a consequence, you have a hard time getting a quorum. And that creates a cascade of problems. And then you have, directors that are not elected, they're running past their terms, and eventually you end up with an entire board. And as with a recent client of mine, they couldn't get quorum for 2 years, and then the entire board was up for election and was replaced in its entirety by a renegade, unhappy group that was the classic dog that catches a bus. Once they were successful, they completely split and began infighting with each other. So it was, yes, but that's the biggest problem right now. It's quorum, because most of the old bylaws have 50%, majority, 50.1% to have quorum. The CPLR, the business corporation law, has a minimum, you go to 1/3. And it just, with with a variety of issues, it's become harder and harder to get quorum. So one of the first things we do when we review bylaws is to see what the quorum requirements are, and do they have trouble getting quorum? Because some co-ops don't, but many do. But the two things I find most prevalent in unreviewed or unimproved bylaws are just technically out-of-date language, like sponsor language. Like, this high-end co-op I represent had a ton of sponsor language, and there hadn't been a sponsor unit in the building since the 1980s. So you had giant provisions about subletting and fees and all these things for a sponsor that just were clutter, what's the term, sludge, things that slow down the process.
Yeah. So the risk there isn't so much a risk. It's just that the bylaws become sort of cumbersome. You're reading through irrelevant.
It's an efficiency issue in that with this muddled language, you're creating just drag on using them, and the possibility that they'll be interpreted in one way or another. But that's more prevalent to the other issue, which is language that is just outright out of date.
And what are you seeing there?
The husband and his wife is the classic, or just he, this, I don't want to use the term woke because it has such a political overtone, but frankly, just out of date language about, gender, etc. Terms, especially legal terms. For my regulated co-ops, a lot of times they talk about being regulated by agencies that no longer exist. There's just, and even in the private co-ops, there's reference to legal terms that are grossly outdated or not relevant anymore. Conversely, there are a ton of language and terms that aren't in the documents at all.
And what kind of language that should be there?
The indemnification language usually needs to be improved, but the thing that we run into the most is any kind of disciplinary action toward renegade board members. Almost all the old bylaws have the simple kind of reference to the business corporation law that the shareholders can remove a director with or without cause. That's a very heavy tool to use. It's very difficult. It requires a special shareholder meeting. 50% of all shareholders have to vote to remove the director. That's a pretty high burden. So what do you do with a board member who is constantly disclosing board business, who's disrupted in meetings, who, look, I've physically had to step in between board members. I take chairs out of people's hands because people's emotions get very high sometimes. And the bylaws are usually absolutely silent on these terms. There's censure, private and public. There's suspension. There's removal. More and more co-ops are going to a provision that allows supermajority of directors to remove another director. And that's the change we see most often is some kind of disciplinary structure for directors. There's also just a lot of general cleanup of another big part of it is flip taxes and fees. A lot of the bylaws don't specifically say the board has the power to levy fees, fines, and penalties. And I've had cases where a shareholder has been penalized for an illegal alteration or something, and they will say we can't do it because of the bylaws, and it's an issue.
Okay, gosh. So updating the bylaws, dealing with board member discipline, with the quorum issues, just returning to quorums, are there strategies, perhaps aside from changing the bylaws, that can get enough shareholders for a quorum?
Well, the joke is you can always tell a well-run co-op because they can't get quorum. Usually when you have quorum, it's because people have pitchforks. They're ready to, burn down the castle. I think that there's a lot of different strategies. One of the best ones is being prepared and giving a lot of advance notice. And one of the advantages of, Zoom and other types of electronic attendance is that it's easier to get quorum because people can attend the meeting while they're feeding the kids dinner, as opposed to a physical meeting where it was just oftentimes hard to get everybody in the room and you relied on proxies. You can do, a pre-game for the meeting of making sure the proxies are out, soliciting them proxies. Another simple solution is door prizes. Surprisingly enough, they are efficient. You give somebody a $200 rent credit, the lucky winner at the meeting, you'd be amazed how many people will show up for $100.
That's a good idea, yeah. And there is such a thing as attendance proxies as well. Is that something that is widely known about and used?
Yeah, that's a greatly underutilized. We use it a lot because it's a tool. I don't advocate for it because I think shareholders have an obligation, like we all do. You should be voting. You should attend, especially to the place you live. But if you're an absentee owner or, you're just really busy and you don't care who the candidates are for the board, an attendance proxy is a proxy that you don't vote. It simply says, I'm here for quorum purposes. And where that's extremely handy is when you're 4 shareholders short of quorum. It's a nice reserve to have so you can get over the quorum requirement.
Okay, so it's a nice to have in a sort of not quite a last resort situation, but it's not something that you would widely advocate because you basically want involvement.
Exactly. I mean, preferably to vote, but for shareholders who don't want to vote, it's easy to, frankly, meet them at the elevator and say, please sign the form. And I've had annual meetings where we've gone out in the hallway and asked people to sign proxies so that we can get the last 10 people we need for quorum.
Gosh. Okay, so what's the first step then for a board if they suspect their bylaws are outdated or causing governance problems?
Well, as always, a nice starting point is to speak with counsel, see what problem, usually we have an ongoing relationship with our clients. We speak to them regularly. So if problems arise, we oftentimes bring these issues to the boards and say, hey, you might consider this for your bylaws. So speak to your counsel, speak to your managing agent, and, start that process. And that process can be driven by the attorney giving you the review and doing the memo, or you can have what many co-ops do is a bylaws committee, because it is the governance tool. You want board input and direction, and you want shareholder input and direction. And these committees are a very efficient tool for getting that done, especially if you're doing substantial review. If your bylaws haven't been edited in 25 years and you're amending, we just did one where we did a combination, amend the bylaws, amend the proprietary lease to clarify a whole ton of problems driven by a very litigious and frankly not sane shareholder who does nothing but litigate and torture the co-op. So a lot of these provisions, and there were 14 amendments to the bylaws and I think 15 amendments to the proprietary lease. So you had almost like, literally you had to cast 30 votes, want to check off these boxes. With that kind of substantial review, it's very good to have the full board and or a committee involved to get it done. If you're just doing, cleaning up the language, editing out the sponsors, putting in some other, less dramatic things, that's council and the board's job. But the one thing I'll point out is most bylaws require a shareholder vote to do substantial amendments, or some of them, a good number of bylaws require a shareholder vote for any bylaw change. And that means you either have a special meeting or what we've found, to get back to your quorum question, it's also not a bad thing to, if you're going to be doing bylaw amendments, to roll them into your annual meeting notice, because it gives people a reason to come to the meeting and drives attendance.
Okay, that's a good spot to leave it. Dean, thanks so much for chatting with me today.
Emily, always a pleasure.
Dean Roberts, partner at Norris McLaughlin. Thank you for tuning in to Habitat's coverage on issues affecting co-op and condo boards.